All right, thank you very much. I hope you guys are enjoying the conference as much as I am. I think the organizers and sponsors and other speakers and hackers and residents and volunteers have all done a really great job. The speakers in particular, I think it's really hit home. It's almost like many of them have been sitting in the meeting rooms that I'm in my office talking about rewriting our jobs processor and getting fed up with data warehousing and things like that. So it's a really great conference. I'm really happy to be here. So that's the little dude that looks like me and lives in my house. He's about 14 months old and just started walking about 2 weeks ago. So that's both very exciting and extremely terrifying all at the same time. So he's a little dude, and he's trying to get big. So this is a great moment, an exciting time for you and your team. The blank slate, when you have a ton of big ideas in your head. And we have a lot of tools that help us get started quickly and move fast. Lots of small things happening very fast, very few hurdles to get over to make things happen. And just as a reminder, at this point in time, your test suite takes 1.5 seconds to run. So your team is moving fast. You're building small things. You're building them quickly. It's really exciting. But things start to change. You start getting more users. You get more visibility. You get more funding, more servers, more. Things get bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, sorry, I'm going to skip over that. All of a sudden, things get really, really big. And if you are in an enterprisey company like the one I work in, you have a whole new level of bigness to deal with. Things like this. And when I was trying to come up with this slide, I was like, what's the biggest, heaviest, most cumbersome thing that I could possibly put on this slide? And enterprise governance won. I think enterprise governance is the kind of thing you could play a practical joke on another team that doesn't know you by just going to one of their meetings and sitting in the back and furiously taking notes. And when they try to talk to you, just tell them you're from enterprise governance. So not all of these things are bad. There is some good in everything on that screen. But dealing with these big things can keep you up at night. So a lot of times I'll wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about, is our background job processor going to be able to handle the load today? Is it time to start thinking about database sharding? And all of those big things have to be thought about and have to be dealt with. But there's a lot of small things that are still going on that we should celebrate and really work to focus on. My name is BJ Allen, and I have the privilege of working at Sabre just up the road. I work on an app called TripCase. TripCase is here to help you take better trips. And I love that tagline because everybody wants to feel relaxed and in control and in the know when it comes to traveling. You want to be the person who gets a notification on your phone that your flight's gate has changed, and you stand up knowingly and look back at all the suckers that don't know what's going on and head off to your new gate. That's what TripCase is here to help you with. I've been writing code for just under 10 years. This is what I did before that. I was a middle school and high school band director in Austin and Round Rock. And I wish I'd had better photographers at the time. My undergraduate degree is in music education from the University of Texas at Austin. Hook 'em horns. Thank you, Aggies. And this is a guy who had a big impact on the way I think about human behavior. This is Dr. Bob Duke. He is the director for the Center of Music Learning at the University of Texas at Austin. And I remember one of the first classes that I had with him in educational psychology and methods. He draws this up on the board. And he says, as teachers, it's our responsibility to set up an environment where feedback happens at very frequent intervals and very low magnitude. And he talks about this. He says, as an example, what's the worst thing you could possibly do? Well, the worst thing is you have a college course that has a midterm and a final, and they're both 50% of your grade. So that's pretty stressful. There's a lot of anxiety involved in that. You go for, it's a 15-week course, you go for 7.5 weeks, and you hit this first midterm. You haven't had any feedback up to that point, and now you have this big, heavy, gigantic thing that you have to deal with. So this peak is maybe 2 a.m. the night before that, where anxiety and stress are at their highest. And you barely pass that midterm. So what does that mean? Well, that means going into the final, it's only worse, right? Or the worst case scenario is you fail that midterm. It's too late to drop the class. You know you're going to fail. Motivation is gone. Sad trombone. Game over, right? So instead what we want is something that looks a little more like this, where feedback happens at very frequent intervals, making each one of those much lower in magnitude. Much less anxiety, much less stress. That's the way to set up a good learning environment. So this is a great idea, but there's actually a lot of research and science to support this. These are a few studies. My wife is the director of music education at SMU here in Dallas, and she sent me a few of these examples. I'll be honest and say I really just read the abstracts, but I pulled out a couple of things. At the top we see students that were quizzed on 2 frequencies, monthly, semi-monthly. That's not that big of a difference. But what we see is the group that was quizzed twice a month outperformed the other group, both in a short-term kind of end-of-semester exam and also more longer-term assessments administered later. And then here at the bottom, this idea of low magnitude, low-stakes quizzing, minor opportunities for feedback at a frequent interval produce significant learning benefits. So this is an important concept, and we talk about feedback a lot in software development, and I think you can take this idea and apply it across much of what we do. And what I'd like to do today is just kind of talk about a few things from my experience with TripCase where this concept applies very appropriately. So when I first started at TripCase, the teams were well underway in a big rewrite, redesign of all of the client applications and code. The mobile app was being rewritten. The desktop web application was being redesigned and mostly rewritten from scratch. And we can kind of argue and talk about whether or not that's a good idea or not, but that's where we were. And the teams were agile. And by agile, I mean not agile at all. There were stand-ups, and there were stories, and there were iterations, and there were demos, but it wasn't very agile. So stand-up meetings. This actually is one of the teams at TripCase, and they were not having a stand-up. I think they were iteration planning or something, and I went in and I said, hey, I need a photo that looks like you're having a stand-up. So everybody stand up, and this is what I got. So thanks a lot, jokers. So if you had come to a TripCase stand-up early on at that point in time, you would have seen this example of people going in and being very vague and kind of mumbling through a status. Well, I kind of started the redesign of the weather tool yesterday. I don't know, I think I could probably have it finished up today. And then the stand-up would end. It would just kind of unceremoniously end, and everybody would go back to their desk and start coding. And that's kind of what everybody wanted to do. They wanted to, this is a waste of time. I just want to get back and get to work. And what happened was they found that that's the whole thing. You go and you mumble very quickly through your report. No one gives you a hard time. You don't stick your neck out. You keep your mouth shut, and you get rewarded. What your reward is, you get to get back to what you wanted to do, which is back to your desk, back to coding. And there's a word for that also in educational psychology. It's called an approval mistake. So the idea here is that regardless of whether it's intentional or explicit, feedback happens, right? And in this case, the feedback was, keep your mouth shut, don't really contribute, get back to your desk faster. And that didn't really help anybody. Communication was bad, story completion rate was horrible, morale wasn't that great. And so this went on for a while until finally we reached this breaking point where we had this kind of like, the agile revival kind of thing. And whether or not you're into that or not, that's a different story, but a lot of this worked for us. And what we found was that it was important for us to ensure that we were giving correct, good feedback to our peers, and the stand-up was a really great example of how to do that. So as a team, we all kind of had this internal agreement about what a good stand-up looked like. And at the end of every stand-up, a little cheesy, but we have a scorecard where we say yes, no, was this good, was this not good? And if it was good, why? And if it was not good, why? And maybe it wasn't good because one person was kind of out to lunch that day. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that and discuss it. And if this feels a little bit like gold stars in elementary school, that's fine, because that kind of stuff works. Yes, no is a very clear answer on whether something is good or bad. So back to that idea of giving negative feedback. If something didn't go well, being able to kind of provide that feedback is really important. And it's really difficult in a professional setting to give negative feedback because we have this kind of idea of this connotation that negative feedback has to be negative. And that's really not the case. Negative isn't necessarily negative. And one of the things that, when you talk about giving negative feedback, there's a few points that I want to make about how to do that to make sure that it is both given properly and received well. And that's this. Negative feedback needs to be accurate. It needs to be contextually appropriate. And that means you're not publicly shaming people and you're not dredging up things that happened 2 months ago. And finally, it should be delivered without emotion. And thank you, strange, weird, mad cat emoticon, for helping me make the point there. So once we got over this hump of being able to accurately describe and give feedback based on what's going on, team communication got a lot better, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, everything else started kind of falling in line and things started getting better. So I would encourage you, whether or not you believe in stand-ups or find value in them, there's a lot of ways that your teams communicate with each other, whether it's in chat rooms or hangouts or stand-up meetings or status meetings or just other ways that you communicate. And I would encourage you to take advantage of the fact to both be very mindful about the feedback you're giving and not shy away from negative feedback with your peers. So the other thing, rewinding to when I joined TripCase, TripCase at the time was kind of a monolithic Rails application. It was running on Enterprise Edition 187, and it was Rails 3.0. And I say it was Rails 3.0 because that was what was in the gem file. But when you actually started digging in the code, you found a very, very healthy dose of weird monkey-patched backports to restore Rails 2 behavior. And I don't know, there had been a lot of turnover, and I don't really know what the reason behind that was. I assume that there was a lot of pressure to get to Rails 3 for some reason, but there was a lot of friction to doing that it was difficult, and so what they ended up doing was kind of taking this middle ground, and it was a horrible middle ground that now we had inherited and kind of had to deal with. And remember, we were in the middle of this big stressful redesign and rewrite, so it didn't seem like the appropriate time to dig up all the dead bodies about why those backports existed and what the right way forward was. So we kind of let the upgrade path slip. And we let it slip for a long time. And I had kind of gotten support from the product team to say, hey, once this redesign is out the door, we really need to go in and start working on these upgrades. And there was a lot of support and buy-in on that, and we felt confident that when redesign was out, we could move forward. So that happened the last piece went out in January of 2013. And so now it was time. We were excited. It was time to start paying off some of this debt, and moving forward with the upgrade path. But I don't know if you remember last January and February, but let me give you a little bit of a reminder. The first thing that happened was a security update in early January. Not a big deal. Upgrade 3.0.18, not a problem. Not a week later, another one, 3.0.19. Everything's great. Get it in, move fast, get it into production. And then the big one happened. This was the one that had the articles that said if you read this at 3 a.m., you need to get out of bed right now and run bundle update in production immediately. So 3.0.20, everything still seems fine. We're still on track with the update. And then this one kind of surprised us. Because I don't know, depending on whether or not you were on 3.0 at the time, you may not have noticed, but there was no 3.0.21. And there were articles, rightfully explaining that this was no longer part of the upgrade path. It wasn't a supported version. It wasn't even supposed to have been for the other ones. So now our plan of kind of doing these upgrades in small pieces over time, the rug got ripped out from underneath us. And all of a sudden, our upgrade now turned into a big, hairy emergency fire drill that we had to do right away. So everybody jumped in. And actually, the night before Big Ruby last year, we put 3.1 into production. And maybe that was a long time ago for some of you, but if you don't remember, active record performance in 3.1 was really, had a lot to be desired. And so immediately on getting that out and getting back on a supported version, we had another big fire drill, which is, performance sucks, move to 3.2. So very soon thereafter, another high-stress environment, another big magnitude change, we put 3.2 into production. So finally, some breathing room. But we knew that this was coming. So we knew, that we had plenty of warning, and we knew, what was this, maybe the end of June, that Ruby 1.8.7 was going to be end of life. And we talked to everybody, and it was time, and we're going to get it right this time. And we did a lot of things right. We created a branch. We set up CI builds for 1.9.3 so that we could kind of measure our progress on fixing tests. We set up dev environments so that we could hammer it with our Selenium tests. Everything was great. But unfortunately, we got one big thing wrong with the Ruby 1.9.3 branch, and that was that we did all the changes in the branch, and it was a very, very long-running branch. So once again, this idea of big, stressful events, we had to merge that branch eventually, and it was big and it was stressful. In fact, here's kind of just one screen full of the files that were changed in this merge request, or in this merge. And so when we finished with this, we had been through the stress of this again, and it was kind of like we had systematically taught ourselves through this feedback that upgrades suck, and that every time there's an upgrade, it's gonna suck. So when we started in on the Ruby 2.0 upgrade, we finally decided to get it right. And so when we looked at this, the 1.9.3 upgrade, most of these changes were not knife-edge cutovers between 1.8.7 and 1.9.3. Most of them could live very happily on both sides of the fence and could have just as easily been merged into 1.8.7 months ago and gone into production for testing. So when we did 2.0, I think we finally kind of learned some lessons and did it the right way, which is we created the branch, we created the Jenkins builds, we had dev environments, but as we made changes in that branch and either fixed deprecations or did library upgrades, we asked ourselves, is this atomic and orthogonal to what we're doing here, and will it work in Ruby 1.9.3? And if the answer was yes, we pulled that out, created a pull request just for that one bit of functionality, committed it to 1.9.3, got it into production. And so finally, when we got to the Ruby 2.0 final merge of that branch, this is what it ended up looking like. It was kind of anticlimactic. It was very low magnitude, no stress, pretty easy. So thankfully, we are now running 2.0 in production, and I think the 2.1 release will follow soon behind and will hopefully follow this same model. So this exists, right? And for the teams out there that are running Rails 2 and love it for whatever reasons, performance and maybe just a lot of customization that's been built up, this is a good idea. But I don't ever want to end up in a situation where I'm having to look for something like this purely by accident because somehow through inertia I got my back up against a wall and couldn't make an upgrade happen even though serious security updates were coming out. So take your upgrade path seriously. No one working on TripCase in the early days thought that was going to happen, that we were going to end up in a weird, stressful situation with upgrades. So take it in small steps. Don't put it all into one branch and try to merge it in at once. Find the deprecations, fix them, get them into your current code base. Make it happen in frequent, low-magnitude steps. Deployments. Pushing code into production should be the best thing we do. It should be our most exciting moments as engineers. But too often, this is what happens. I can't imagine because I've lived it, it's a horrible, sad thing when a development team stops looking forward to releases. When release night gives you indigestion, when you don't look forward to it, right? Jez Humble is one of the authors on continuous delivery. He's got a great article that talks about principles of low-risk releases. And I want to talk about a few of those this morning. So the first one, low-risk releases are incremental. Upgrading in a big bang release is the highest risk way to roll out new functionality. Very high magnitude. Instead, deploy components independently. Database changes can also be rolled out incrementally. So I want to point out that in the early stages, this is great. This is lovely. Rails migrations were huge, right? They took a lot of the burden away and made it a lot easier to kind of move our database forward. But when you get big, all of a sudden you're going to find that you have a table in production that has 20 plus million rows, and it was added very early on in the project when timestamp columns weren't automatic, right? And you're going to find that that table, for some reason, has a created at column, but not an updated at. And you're going to all of a sudden have a business intelligence requirement that takes, that really needs that updated at column. So this all of a sudden is no longer going to work for you. So taking and setting up a process in which you can get those schema changes and other database migrations out of your deployment process and into, we use some Percona tools for online schema changes or schema migrations, but getting that out of your deployment so that your deployment in and of itself is low magnitude is a really important thing to do. Principle 2, decouple deployment and release. Deployments are what happens when you deploy code, when you put code in a new environment. Release is what happens when you make some part of that system available to users. So really what we're talking about here are feature flippers, right? Feature toggles. And the idea here is that if you deploy everything and turn everything off in one big bang, everybody's online, everybody's got to be there from start to finish to do checkouts and verification and smoke tests and everything else that goes along with it. But if you can split these things, all of a sudden you can go back to the original theory that I brought up, which is high frequency, low magnitude. So push the code. Everything's working, check the graphs, let's go to sleep. The next day, the team that was actually involved in that feature can be the ones to be online and choose when that feature goes live, right? Turn it on. There are also, also the other benefit of feature toggles is that you can turn it right back off if things are not good. So, we've already mentioned some of these today, rollout and degrade as great tools. TripCase kind of has a bit of a homegrown YAML toggle that has a lot to be desired and could be improved a lot, but it still does the job that we're looking to get done. Principle number 3. When you deploy to production more often, you're practicing the deployment. And that's the important thing here, right? If you're not confident in your deployment and you release once a month, you are getting 12 opportunities to get feedback and improve upon that. I think that's tragic, right? Here's something that you know should be better and that you want to be better. If you're not doing something to make sure that you're getting an opportunity to practice that, then you should make some changes. For example, there's no reason why, there's some risk involved in just pushing the same code again, but why not? Practice it. Make it as low risk as possible to practice your deployments as often as possible. And of course, smaller change sets are going in, so it's much easier to figure out what went wrong. CPU went up by 10%. Let's go dig through the commits from the last release. That's a horrible situation to be in when you have to dig through 12, a full month of changes. So the last thing about deployments is that the frequency and magnitude of your deployments can have a big impact on the behavior of your development teams. For example, whatever feature is almost done. The release, code freezes tomorrow, it's almost done. So what do? Well, we have two choices. We can either rush it or we can wait forever, right? And 9 times out of 10, because we want to get that code out there, we're going to choose the former. And that increases the risk of this already high magnitude event that's happening. So if we take this approach, it's basically the same, except for this is a very short time. So it's kind of this analogy of trains leaving the station. If I am getting out of my car to walk up to the platform to catch a train, and I know it's the last train of the day, I'm going to run. Whereas if I know another one's going to be along in 5 minutes, I may take my time. So I think those are just a few examples in what I've seen working at TripCase that kind of exemplify this model of keeping things small, keeping things frequent, keeping them as low stress and low anxiety as possible. And this is not a new idea, right? This is something that we talk about quite a bit. Here's kind of an oldie but a goodie. Jason Fried from the now Basecamp company. Make tiny decisions. Tiny decisions are easier to change, they're less costly. Take big projects, take big complex processes, and make them as tiny and frequent and low magnitude as possible. So this is the first conference talk I've given. It's been really good for me to kind of prepare these slides, not least of which is that it kind of forced me to stop playing threes and get back to working on my slide deck. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get up here and share some thoughts about working on a big Ruby application. So thank you.